I really apologize for not being with you, but as you have mentioned, we have 65 members of Women Now teams who are trapped into underground under heavy shellings and facing risk of famine. So we are completely working on emergency response, so I couldn't make it. So about civil society in Ghouta, first of all, I want to give you just a very quick idea about civil society in Ghouta before the last 10 days. In Ghouta, we have the largest number of Syrian local organizations according to Citizens for Syria last report. There is around 150 local community organizations, which is, as I said, the largest numbers. And in Ghouta, at the area has been besieged for the last 6 years. The organizations are really an integral part of the community, and they are working and creating their programs out of the need of the people. And they have been kind of protected of the implementing of one of all kind of project. And I think it is why today we can see a kind of organized response to what is happening today. So today in Ghouta we have 400,000 civilians stuck into underground shelters who are not prepared at all. No sanitaries, no water, facing shelling and famine. Syrian civil society there has been working to respond to this situation since the first day. Divided itself into working groups. So there is groups working on statements, just statements. There is group working on need assessments, on reporting. For the reporting, we have the very good work of the Child Protection Network, who is issuing every day reports on child situation in Ghouta. We have emergency response groups who are working on rehabilitations of shelters, activity with children. A lot of women and women activists are today working to support the children there. Also, there is activists who are now working just to help the other, based on what they have learned in first aid. A question that we received today was how to help a woman deliver in a shelter. So the civil society are trying today to be the voice of civilians there. So because everybody on the media are talking about the shellings, but no one is talking about the famine, because people cannot leave their shelters. So, and even when they leave it, they don't have, there is nothing to buy, even if they have money. So I think it is a huge role for civil society to be the voice of the civilians and express their needs, and also to support civilians themselves raising their voice. In Women Now, for example, we are receiving a lot of women testimonies, even through WhatsApp messages. So we are working on transcriptions, translations, even if they are filming videos, to put the subtitle and send it to international community, which is, to support them raising their voice.
Great. Thank you, Maria, for this idea. We did see that there's a level of organization, widespread work, and very localized work in Ghouta. And I know this is not the case everywhere, but there's definitely a level of achievement that civil society has done. Throughout the day, I'm sorry you weren't with us, but in sessions about areas under the regime control, out of the regime control, and the post-ISIS regions that have just been liberated from ISIS, we have noticed that the civil society has been mentioned quite regularly by people with different interests and from different angles. So I see that 7 years of work by civil society has now started to being picked up by other groups. So we know it's being acknowledged, but unfortunately there's very little ways on how to help. So could you talk to me about the particular challenges that civil society is facing and what can be done to help the civil society in Ghouta, who's doing all this great work, to continue working, the direct and also the indirect issues, please?
Actually, yeah, for sure, the protections of civilians and civil society. You know that we have lost one of the most prominent women leaders in our network last year because of the shelling in Ghouta, in all over Syria, not just in Ghouta, but now I'm talking especially about Ghouta. Protection. The second challenge for me is sustainability. We have been working in Daria for 2 years, and then Daria, the population have been displaced. Now we are facing the same risk in Ghouta. So civil society being displaced with own populations, then people are facing the failure of international communities to support them, to protect them, and the failure of for them the value that they have been working on, the failure of the value of democracy, the value of dignity they have been working on. So lots of activists now in civil society are asking themselves why I'm here, what can I do, because of like being surrounded of all this kind of failures.
Yeah. And that's a very important point, because what we've seen in the Syrian case is that the term civil society is used to define a very large spectrum of activities, including governance, including sometimes humanitarian aid and civil support, and mainly most things done by civilians other than who don't want to be involved in armed work. And unfortunately, for those who are fighting, they can see tangible wins and losses, while for those who don't have such a tangible things, there's always this value question. What can people in this room do to address these challenges, Maria?
Yeah, as I said, I think we need all kind of political pressure to support and protect the people. We need to understand the situation on the ground, so to support civil society creating their programs based on the needs and based on people dreams. And I don't know if you can imagine, like I'm sure all of you have heard of Niveen Hotari, the woman who is now publishing on her Facebook what is happening on Ghouta. Niveen is a part of our network, but what I want to Niveen, like 5 months ago, she was looking to a training on journalism. So a woman in Ghouta and living in Siege, she have a dream to be a journalist. So what we have done is that we open a training on journalism for women, so those women can tell their stories. So sometimes for donor, it's not attractive, it's not interesting, but the people have dreams, and we need to support them in our small dreams, because it is what makes difference. It is really what is making difference today. The voice of Niveen is making a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. My last question is on the work you're doing in areas that are not as dire as Ghouta, and I know you're spread around the country, but also in Lebanon and in neighboring countries. Could you tell me a little bit about the work that's relevant to peace building? How do you see it? What the impact you see it's making, particularly on the communities that you work directly with?
Okay. sorry, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Hello?
you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I
Examples
think
if you want.
I think Bada'i report on peace building gives a lot of wonderful example on peace building, and that donors community have to take into account um, uh, how local community are working on peace building because of the need of peace at local levels, because mothers needs the peace, but also the example that I want to give you today is also from the network we are supporting. So in our women centers, we open sessions for discussions about political issue, what is happening around Syria, because one of the risks also that is facing civil society is to be trapped on its own reality. Civil society of Raqqa, civil society of Damascus, civil society of Aleppo. So we need channels today between all of these civil societies and even between the communities. So in the refugee community in Lebanon, we just opening a safe place for women to discuss their problems. And last week or a few days ago, we women in our centers were preparing for a demonstration for Ghouta, and they were discussing. And one woman for Afrin came and talked about Afrin, what is happening in Afrin. And the women from Ghouta, well, they didn't know what is happening there. Now they have someone who is coming from there. They are listening to human stories, a woman like them, a mother. And so in the demonstration, they both of them have signs about Ghouta and Afrin, because a civilian is a civilian everywhere. And it is how civil society are supporting this peace building. And sometimes just by opening a safe place for discussions and giving tools for community to discuss. And here I just want to mention one point. Women now has withdrawn from a call for peace building a few months ago. The call was open for 15 days, a call for peace buildings. And I think look international community, how they are looking to peace building as a project to be implemented in Syria will never work. Peace building will only be done by the locals when they are putting their priority, and we are supporting them in their priority.
Absolutely, and I think Ola has a lot to add on this about the experiences on peace building. I will just tell you an experience we had very recently about how, unfortunately, with many, many years of experience, governments, including the government of this country, are not taking into consideration the local, the interest of the local community when building peace. Things are being dictated to local communities, how they're done. Unfortunately, peace-building projects which were supposed to go to the smallest groups to continue the wonderful work they're doing is being summed up and given to massive organizations. We're speaking about millions and armies of grant writers, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this. And this, we're seeing the impact of this directly on organization. And your organization is big. Just imagine the small groups all around Syria who are doing fantastic work. That's wonderful, Maria. Thank you so much. I'm going to actually open the floor. If anybody has a question for Maria that would like to be addressed before, unfortunately, she needs to leave the conversation, please let me know. No? Yeah? Wael. Could you please just say your name and affiliation?
Hi, Maria. My name is Wael Sowa. I have a three-part question. Part number one.
Wow.
How do you think the Ghouta will make it? Will survive the attack? Part number two, how long it could continue resisting this horrible attack? And number three, if it didn't make it, what will be the direct outcome of the regime entering the Ghouta? Thank you.
Thank you. Maria,
Wow.
go ahead. There's no more questions.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm not a political expert, so I cannot tell you for how long Ghouta can make it, but seeing the international community failure in protection of civilians, I can say for not for a long time. But when I see civilians saying we want to stay there, we want to stay here, and we don't want to be displaced, and even if that channel will be open, we will not leave, I think like those people are really, I don't want to ready to die, because no one wants to die. But I think people of Ghouta today are aware that leaving their place is equal to death for them. So I don't know. I cannot say more. I cannot just ask international community to do something, because if Ghouta didn't make it, so it's not just, I will not say it's a new tragedy in Syria stories. No, we are entering a new phase of destructions and a new phase of Syrian civil war, because those people will not have any place to go there. They cannot go to Idlib, they cannot go to Daraa, they cannot go to Lebanon. So I don't know if we will leave Syria to Bashar al-Assad and armed groups, and civilians and civil society will be, I don't know where.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you and your team and Women Now for Development for the wonderful work you continue to do despite an unbelievable amount of challenges, and all the inspiring and innovative work you're doing. Thank you very much for making the time to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to move now to our other speakers. So with me here, there's Ola Ramadan, who's the founder and director of Bada'il, a peace-building organization, and Salim Salame, who's the director of the Palestinian League for Human Rights. And I'm going to, just to continue where we stopped with Maria, I'm going to ask you, Ola, about in the places where Bada'il is working, how do you see the work of civil society? What exactly is civil society doing now in the places you have access to?
Okay, thank you, Leila. First of all, I would like to mention that I'm going to talk about the non-governmental areas control, so I'm not going to tackle the regime area controls because we don't work there. I might provide some kind of like general observations about the work of civil society in the regime area, but not in depth. It's very clear to us that civil society, and I'm going to speak, of course, about the civil society inside Syria, because I think the civil society experience outside Syria in the neighboring countries or the one who are based in Europe have a little bit of a different experience, except for the one who is doing cross-border activities. Civil society groups, let's call them, inside Syria are basically the scope of work that they are doing and the type of activities and projects they are implementing is very much linked to the situation on the ground and very much linked to the needs of their communities. Therefore, we do find a lot of commonality between the different civil society groups in different areas in the non-governmental areas control. However, we do see some of these differences based on who is controlling the area and based on what is the need of the groups there. So I'll give a couple of examples to clarify this. If we look at Hasake, which is basically controlled by the PYD, we see that the type of activities that civil society are doing is very much different from the type of work that is done in Idlib, for example. In Hasake, Yes. In Hasake, you would see that many of the civil society groups are focusing on women local participation, women's rights. They avoid completely working in education. That's just like two quick examples. And the reasons behind that is that, first of all, PYD present themselves as, supporting to women's rights and to women inclusions. And they welcome basically such kind of work, but it has to be in some levels linked to what Ittihad Star or Star Union is doing, which is basically a part of the PYD affiliated kind of union. The education, despite of the fact that many of the civil society groups in the Hasaki region are completely against what the PYD have introduced in terms of like education by, introducing the Kurdish language, eliminating the Arabic language. However, they cannot basically do anything regarding that because it seems to be like a red line for the PYD. So they basically decided not to tackle these issues. I'm not saying here that the civil society groups in Hasake are only doing what the PYD are doing, but like other areas, when it comes to certain kind of activities which is very much challenging to the PYD, they'd rather do it indirect way or underground. Yeah. So for example, child recruitment, we all know that PYD are recruiting children. And the child recruitment is absolutely a red topic for the PYD. However, we still see that many of the civil society do address the issue indirectly by raising awareness, by discussing, by having some kind of life skills, let's say nonviolent communication, the importance of nonviolent communication among adolescents, etc. While if we go taking the same exact example and going to Idlib, for example, again, child recruitment as an example is also an issue because other armored groups are also recruiting children. Maybe it's not as red line as in the PYD area, but still a group in Saraqib who basically believe that children have the right to continue their educations and they should not be recruited, etc. They still cannot address this kind of issue publicly. And I would give one example of when our partners in Saraqib, a women group who basically addressed the issue of child recruitment through providing psychosocial support to adolescents. And they just do it in the kind of like a very let's say underground. They call the psychosocial support, but on the same time they're doing this kind of awareness and education. And here I would like actually to mention that, for example, and I think it was mentioned in the morning, that women groups are most likely to implement projects which is mainly related to economic empowerment. So it's very much acceptable that those groups could, carry on activities and projects related to sewing and pickle making and these kind of things, which we all know that, it's socially acceptable. It's acceptable by the armed group and the people who are controlling these areas. However, I would encourage all of us to investigate more and to learn more about what is beyond and behind, these kind of activities. I know from our partners and people and activists that I have like high respect to them, that this is doing such kind of projects. It's the only way for them to meet with women and talk to them and address other issues, including women's rights. Not to make the pictures very pink, of course, there are other groups who are basically doing it for the sake of doing it, and there is nothing behind that. And to emphasize on the idea is that civil society groups are basically doing based on the needs of their communities. Thanks for Maria for bringing the examples of the Dair report on women peace activism inside Syria. And here I would like to highlight this issue is that Peace building as a terminology is perceived as very much negative among communities and sometimes among civil society grassroots groups as well. And we can analyze, there's many reasons behind that, how the terminology has been used, how it has been presented by NGOs, how it's been presented by international community, how it's been presented by the Assad himself. Because let's not forget that Assad is the first one who has initiated the reconciliation ministry and brought Ali Haider to be basically the minister, while for those who doesn't know Ali Haider, his son Ismail was killed by the regime. And he used basically such kind of, to promote reconciliation, but many people do perceive this as shaking hands with Assad, and therefore is not absolutely acceptable for them. But when we are doing this research, and I do think that it seems to be a little bit outdated, but even it was published in 2015, but till today, people still, from our observation, have similar approaches to when we conducted the research. They do not say that they do peace building. They don't bring the word peace, but they rather do activities which basically related to peace building. At the same time, sometimes it's extremely challenging for the civil society to address issues like related to like a certain kind of a hot topic. So let's take Afrin as an example. What happened is that in Afrin, from how I see it, it's going actually to determine the future of Syria and the relations between the Kurds and Arabs. We don't know what's going to happen next, but absolutely the Afrin is a turning point regarding the relations between the Kurds and the Arabs and the Arabs. Even the civil society groups that we work with in Hasake, for example, who were very much, have the human rights values, etc., they backed up when it comes to addressing the relations between the Arabs and the Kurds, even in their regions, although they are doing some kind of coexistence activities, because they are seeing what the others are basically, discussing and addressing the issues. And sometimes it's, things need to take a little bit of, time to calm down till people be able to respond to it, because the first response seems to be quite aggressive when it comes to Afrin. The last point that I would like to make is that also to emphasize that civil society sometimes also feel that they're all the time in emergency and they need to do something, and it's very much changing based on the situation. I'll give the example of what happened recently in Ghouta, and I think that was launched on Saturday, the statements of civil society groups and Faylaq al-Rahman, Jaish al-Islam and others, who basically presented a solution for Ghouta by saying, okay, so the regime excuse and the Russian excuse for shelling and destroying Ghouta is because there is Nusra and other extremist groups inside. So here we're providing you with a solution. We can guarantee evacuation of all the fighters and extremists of Nusra and others outside of Ghouta if you stop the shelling. And who basically started this initiative? It's civil society activists. It's civil society groups. They understood the needs of addressing something and presenting an idea, even if there is a failure for this initiative that came from them. And they went to Faylaq al-Rahman, Jaish al-Islam and others. And that comes also from the needs of the people that Maria was talking about when Wael asked her the question, is that people do not want to leave their houses. They don't want to see another scenario of Aleppo. This is not the scenario that we would like to see for Ghouta. So they came with the urgency, have pushed them to take such kind of action. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I definitely agree with you. And my main takeout from what you were saying is one of the great contributions of civil society to the discourse around the conflict has been providing a high level of flexibility in understanding and adapting and responding to issues, which hasn't been the case in the community at large. Definitely hasn't been the case with groups who have the militarized power. And the other issue is the need to increase our trust, and us, all of us, civilians, Syrian civilians, but also those who are involved in the conflict, both in humanitarian, civil society support, or governments who have interest in this conflict. The fact that the actor who we can now only invest in trusting their long-term interest, and the fact that, just like the small groups you mentioned, the fact that they can only do suing workshops now doesn't mean that they're not working for something longer term. We need to invest in that. And that brings me to the point that Zaina raised today. This amazing ability to work within the margin. We're still not going to be able to control the 90% who's still controlled by those who are socially acceptable, who conform to the hierarchy of power, but civil society and civilians are working within this 10% that's making a lot of difference. That will take me to Salim. And Salim, we were discussing before, and you had excellent points on how do the challenges and the situation of civil society, how does that translate in a post-conflict kind of aspect? How do you see that going?
Thanks, Leila. It's a great honor to share the platform with Ola and Maria. I'm very sad Maria is not here with us today. It's such a loss because she's one of the most devoted and most sincere activists. I've had the honor and the pleasure of working with them. So my thoughts and our thoughts goes to her and to her team in Ghouta. To answer the question, I think one of the challenges we are facing today as civil society is to actually remain as part of the equation. And that is because the polarization and the pressure is extreme. And we are, in many cases, we are left between the rock and a hard place. And that is not always because of regime practices. That's also sometimes because of the international community practices as well, unfortunately. So I think the maintenance and the protection of this fragile and yet very active, very proactive, and very important entity is very, very important. And I think this takes me to the point of the systematic inclusion, because we will be talking a little bit about the dimension of protection, which Maria touched upon a bit, but talking about what is doable in terms of the international community. I think the mechanism of involving the civil society so far through the civil society consultation room led by Stefan de Mistura is one of the most important mechanisms, but one of the mechanisms that can be made much more productive. And that is because one of the concerns that we've been hearing repeatedly is about the agenda setting of the consultation process. This needs a continuous and sincere evaluation by the big countries who are involved in Geneva process and the countries that are sponsoring this sort of consultative process. So I think there are things that can be done in the international level, because most of the time we hear that in terms of international players, in terms of what can be done inside Syria, most of the time we hear the argument of our hands are tied, which we will come to at some point, because all the time things are blamed on the Russian player. But on the international level, I think that there are things that can be done. Of course, where is Geneva today and how is this relevant? This is something is up for debate. But I think there was some discussion in Washington recently about mainstreaming Geneva again and coming back to sort of, revitalizing the process. And I think regardless how hopeless we feel about it, it remains one of the cornerstones, and it remains one of the channels through which we can, as civil society, hopefully make some impact.
Absolutely. And also, very importantly, when we're speaking about Geneva as if it's one homogeneous process, I remember in 2015, I'm sure many of you remember, when there was a serious proposal that there's going to be a conversation between 3/3. One of them is going to be the regime, and one of them is going to be the opposition, and the third is going to be civil society. And that was the only time where civil society was actually counted as a party to this conflict. And suddenly in September, this was completely off the table, and civil society wasn't told. And we ended up with groups with an advisory role or with consultative role. And by all means, they need to consult and take advice from civilians and civil society all the time, but an actual place on the table disappeared. And then we end up with an asitana process where we get told that no need for civil society or women or anybody who's armed men who control territory, and we get told that they're going to negotiate ceasefire, and if Bosnia is anything to learn from, they're going to come back with a constitution. So definitely the way how we are engaging civil society in the more formal process is important. Ola, do you want to tell me, because I know that Bada'il had made several decisions about invitation you got to be part of the civil society room. Can you tell me about the logic you had behind that?
Yeah, sure. Well, we basically, I mean, as you mentioned, Leila, we have been invited a couple of times to take part of the civil society room. And we at Bada'il, as an organization who's mainly focusing on peace building, we see the importance of the inclusion of civil society in the peace building process. Actually, this is one of the main things that we work on. But we basically rejected the invitation for like several reasons. One of them is that, I mean, people make decisions all the time without having the Syrian voices, you know. The whole decisions about the establishment and the mechanism of the establishments of the civil society room was, despite of what they might, you know, promote it by saying that it was based on consultations, there was not actually, you know, consultations on the establishment of the room. Civil society was not part right from the beginning of designing how they will and how should, you know, what is the modality basically for their participation in the peace processes. And that was one of the main concerns, is that we believe that civil society, Syrians, should have the voice of deciding on the modality, with all respect to you know, the expertise of the INGOs and the technicality that they have, which the Syrian might not have, or we're building it, but still the voice of the Syrian people need to be there. In many times there was rush into the invitations itself. So you would receive the invitation and then you have to be present in Geneva in 4 days. I mean, like just to make a decision for like an organization like Bada'il, and I know Women Now is the same, Baytuna is the same, many other Syrian organizations who are doing cross-border activities, you need to consult with your team. And given that everyone is in different places, you need to consult with your board. Our board is all over the place. So like just to take the time to discuss and deeply reflect on, you know, whether you go or you don't, you need time. You can't be present in Geneva the next day. When following, you know, up on the civil society room and the type of work that they're doing, which is something that I hear all the time from our colleagues and partners who are part of the room, is that so far the civil society rooms comes to the meeting with already a set agenda of what they need to discuss, and that's very problematic. I mean. With all respect to the efforts that Demystifying and his team are like trying to do, but before setting the agenda for the civil society who would come and meet in Geneva for a couple of days, ask them what they would like to work on, what is important for them, what is the feedback that they would like to provide into the process. In many cases, the situation was, you know, completely about, let's say, Ghouta, and you are discussing constitutions. I mean, there is certain kind of priorities that you need to, so, yeah.
I cannot help seeing the similarities between when inclusion is happening from a point of privilege. It's exactly like the problems we face when including women. Those with privilege, whenever they look at including others, they look at them as storytellers, with all due respect to storytellers, but Syrians are always welcome to come and tell stories about victimization, and only certain kind of victimization, exactly like women. So we get a panel of men telling us opinions, and then a woman to tell us about her story about losing a child, and so on. And with Syrians, it's exactly the same. You get loads of academics and politicians telling us about the future of the country, but then there's always the Syrian who's going to tell us, so how was it living and growing up under the Assad regime? And then we'll get all the other important people to tell you. So I totally agree, and yes, please.
This is why initiatives like Families for Freedom are doing fantastic work, because one of the most important demands for many, many Syrians, and that is the release of prisoners, is not even now up for debate at all. I mean, it is totally absent from the international agenda. Like hundreds of thousands of Syrians are still in the prisons of Bashar al-Assad, and this is not even something that is mentioned at all. So Families for Freedom today, outside all those formalities, outside Geneva, outside everything, they took a bus, they are driving around, and they are saying, like, our family members are imprisoned. And this is still something relevant for us. It's a demand that we will not let pass, you see. So, but again, we need formal processes as much as we need informal processes and creativity like the one of Families for Freedom, because I think we've been creative for too long now, 7 years of creativity. We're also getting exhausted as well.
Absolutely. Sorry, to follow up on this point and on the civilian framing of the political process, Families for Freedom is one of the options. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on this particular point, and also about the sequencing of the peace processes, and where do the civilians stand from that?
I think in terms of the civilian framing of the political process, we can see that the cycle is being repeated. You have political negotiations that are going nowhere. Because the regime knows very well that their military strategy is working very well, so there is no need actually to compromise or to change anything. And we saw this happening again in Sochi. There is a strange sort of and sad and sometimes pathetic sort of repetition, déjà vu of these sort of talks, and there is also very scary point for me, and I think many other people as well, the idea that we can still deal with the regime as an entity that can be controlled via the Russians or via the Iranis. And I don't know how accurate is that, to be honest. I mean, look at the Constitutional Committee that was put up in Sochi. I mean, as a method to move forward. I mean, the regime didn't even pick it up, to discuss. So the political processes are moving in one side, and life and reality and bombardment and daily death in Syria is moving in another side. Since the adoption of the resolution for Eastern Ghouta 4 days ago, according to the count of Child Protection Network, we have 96 civilians killed in 4 days' time, beside the plus 400 that were killed last week. You have medical points who are still under bombardment, targeted on purpose. And you have no aid that was allowed in, although I think the first and the 7th article of the resolution stated very clearly that aid provisions is one of the key reasons for the resolution of Ghouta to be assessed. And this takes me to the question of, like, what was the risk assessment of the two countries that sponsored the resolution? This is Sweden and Kuwait, because clearly the violation of the resolution was one possibility. And what is also the opinion of the other countries in the Security Council that supported the resolution and endorsed it, when the Russian, when they all the time keep repeating that, well, Russia will pressure, Russia will deliver, Russia will, I mean, Putin is begging for 5 hours ceasefire window, and Assad is not even considering that, Like, he's firing and raining people with bombs. So in terms of the political process, I think it's like just the same repeated cycle. Now, in terms of the sequence, the most terrifying thing is the what also was being discussed in Washington in the last couple of weeks, is the constitution, then transition, then elections. Yeah. And I think, like, just in terms taking the proposal at face value, let's just think of the logistical dimensions of the proposal. You need to you need a census. You need to the census to be nationwide. You need refugees to take part in this process of elections. You need diaspora to be included. You have IDPs all over the country, beside the 5-6 million who are living around the country, the refugees. So you have as well a significant number of prisoners that I think, deserve also to vote, right? Spending 5-6 years in the presence of the regime, I mean, the least in terms of their civil rights. What guarantees do we have for all of this to be achieved? This is, I mean, it's just horrific because basically, how do you count the votes? How do you agree with the regime? How can you guarantee that there is actually a credible candidate that can stand and challenge Bashar al-Assad? You know, so in terms of the logistics, it's a nightmare. And this is, again, it is being discussed as if we're not talking about, you know, a country that has been going through a tragic reality for the past 7-8 years, but rather, you know, a young democracy that we are trying to give a push forward. So I think the idea of elections, then constitution, is not feasible in terms of logistics alone. Let alone, of course, the moral dimension of allowing Assad to remain there for the next 2-3 years. And again, as I said, in foreign policy of the major countries reemerges the idea of the Russians will deliver, which I think many players are choosing to hide behind in order to dissolve themselves from their responsibility.
Agreed. I know there's many pressing questions, but I'm being selfish taking the time to my own. But there's a really a question that gets asked in this place and in these circles all the time, and I'd love to hear both your thoughts. Ola gave concrete examples about the flexibility of civil society that does what's possible to achieve what's not necessarily allowed by whoever is controlling the territory. Several times, the British government, the US government, and others have done the whole of government approach, which says that all aid gets cut off immediately when there's a group that they identify as terrorist controls the area. And there's an assumption that if those who control the area are terrorists, then there wouldn't be space for civil society to do work. What do you think of that? What do you think civil society has been able to do under the many extremist groups, and what would be your recommendations in terms of this thinking?
Let me say, Leila, that funds and cutting of fund has been one of the main challenges, or in the top of the challenges since the beginning of, or since the civil society started to emerge in 2012. And I would like, before talking about the cut of fund, to address this issue a little bit. We all know that funding is very much linked about the sustainability. With the system, I mean, you can't be basically having an operation and sustain your operation without having, funding and money on board. And here is a big challenge. Let's put it this way. Even if we look at the funding strategy over the past 5-6 years. Sustainability has been always an issue. So, like, for example, you provide a group with a certain, or like an NGO with a certain amount of money for like a year or two, but then you cut the funding suddenly, or maybe with an artist. But then, what is next? How these organizations or groups are going to sustain their operation if there is a continuous change in strategies and no long-term support? The short-term support will never, ever enable the civil society to grow and to sustain and to have long-term objectives. And I always tell my teams that, what is the point if we're like 5 years old and stop tomorrow? I mean, all the work that we have achieved over the past 5 years is nothing, because the type of work that Bada'il do is more long-term. It's preparation, it's mitigating violence, it's about human rights. And among this madness, you need to continue doing what you're doing, basically, maybe for the next 20 years in order to have, a great impact, or the impact that you would like to have. Now, coming to the cutting of funding because of extremist group or HTC or ISIS. I remember when ISIS controlled Deir ez-Zor, and there was an immediate decisions of cutting all the funds from the civil society groups in Deir ez-Zor. We continued to work in Deir ez-Zor almost a year and a half after ISIS controlled Deir ez-Zor. And it's a disaster because people will want to continue their activisms, even if it's underground and even if they're taking a huge risk. And we know many of good examples of how people were, trying to resist what ISIS has been, forcing them to do through education, through, meetings in closed doors, in houses, etc. But when they don't have the support from the outside world, whether it's financial support, whether it's technical support, or even, emotional support, let's put it this way, they will feel that no one actually care about them, and with time they will stop doing what they are doing. The question is, do we want the groups in Idlib today to stop doing what they are doing? They are the one who will basically challenging all this extremism, and they are the one who is giving us hope. By cutting this funding, that means many of these groups will probably disappear or stop functioning, or depend completely on volunteerism, which is basically, you can volunteer your time and a little bit of money, but that's not sustainable. And the last thing I would like to bring an example of something that Maria said, is that which needs further investigations, but HTC seems to be starting to think of supporting women groups inside Syria, in Idlib, which, as I said, it's something that needs to be further investigation. And what I want to say here is that when groups, when communities do not receive the right support, they might take other direction. Not all of them, but some of them definitely will do. And that will also take me back to 2012, 2011, when these tansiqiyat started to emerge as civil society groups, or local groups started to emerge. The Muslim Brotherhoods, they didn't find any kind of support. It was, they were starting. So basically people didn't know about them, but Muslim Brotherhoods knew about them, and they started to, channel money inside Syria. And I remember talking to activists, and they was like, yes, we need to be active. We need to support. We need to meet the needs of our local communities, and we can't stay, doing nothing. So if the money is coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, we'll take it for the good cause. And that's require more thinking, because I think it will, continue to be the same.
Absolutely. And on this note, I want to highlight what Rena mentioned earlier today about this obsession with the institutionalization of civil society and activism, where organizations, small groups who are doing fantastic work on almost no resources, are pushed immensely to go and register and have 3 years of audited accounts because they want $500 to do psychosocial support in the middle of Idlib. It's absolutely insane. And it also takes me to the issue that Bassett raised earlier on the north and the south and the employment of women. And one question we keep asking ourselves is, yes, we do see more women doing work, but whenever we see that, are they underpaid or unpaid or forced to work? The chances are, in many cases, they are. And the second question, is their employment challenging the hierarchy of power? In most cases, it's not. So yes, free labor, everybody will be happy to get free labor. They would still do all the unpaid work at home. They'll still most likely be unpaid outside, but they will be given as example about how wonderful situations are for women. So, and it's civil society who told us to look at these things because they make all the difference. I'm gonna, we still have half an hour, so I'm gonna open for questions now before we go back to our speakers. Please say your name and affiliation before the question. Okay, so I have 2 questions here and then a question there.
Thank you very much, Asad Lashi from Beit Nasariya. My question, Ola, would be around the cutting in funding that you were mentioning. Do you see this as well as an attempt to co-opt some of the medium to larger size NGOs and basically push them to go register in Damascus? There has been a lot of discussion about this recently, and a lot of push, at least that we feel, being in Gaziantep, being in Turkey, that the regular visits now by the UN resident coordinator in Damascus to Turkey, the discussions that are happening. Do you see this cutting in funding as a mechanism as well to kind of push people and coerce them into aligning in a certain sense?
Rena, we're going to take 3 questions. So.
2 questions, actually. One about the
Rena,
shrinking
name
space.
and affiliation, please.
Oh, Rana Khalaf, independent consultant. Can you tell us a little bit more about the shrinking space in the neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, and what's happening exactly, and how this is politicizing the inside? And the other question is about those invisible power structure Leila has been talking about. In regards to women, you know, we hear the PYD is supporting women's empowerment, co-presidency, you know, women are visible in PYD-controlled areas. So can you tell us more about this? And if, I don't know, but I've been observing that the highest number of civil society organizations working on gender-based violence are in these areas, the PYD-controlled areas. I was just speculating, is this because violence has increased, or is it just more space that this is an issue that's being tackled?
Great, thank you. Zaina,
I want to know what you think is going to be happening within the next 2 to 3 years. We've seen many NGOs. My name is Zaina, I'm a Syrian journalist. We've seen many NGOs, big ones and small ones, shutting down in neighboring countries. Do you think the local ones will be able to survive? On what basis? And also in the previous session, we touched the base about working with those NGOs who are in regime-held areas. I'm interested to know what's your intake, both of you.
Thank you. Shall we take these 3 questions and move to more? Who would like to start?
I can start from the very end.
Yep.
In terms of what the next 2-3 years. I mean, back to the morning session, as Sinan was saying, I think if the conversation is not centered around stabilization, you know, I think the erosion will carry on in terms of a lot of operations inside the country, because I think we're clinging to the very last. Sort of bar of effort available. And you know better than me, because you left many years after me, that people are operating on a reserve of energy that is very, very low. And it is extremely scary for me to think about 2 to 3 years of similar brutality, simply because if we consume and exhaust the existence of the civil society in Syria in a post-conflict and actual transition period, the international community is actually going to be losing more than they expect to lose, because one of their most trustworthy and accountable counterpart and partner is going to be almost eradicated. So this is also something of a strategic value, I think, to think about for the long term. Long term meaning here 10 to 15 years also. Do you want this partner that emerged organically and managed to fill in a void that is immense to vanish totally? This is also a question I think the Foreign Office and other entities should take into consideration when they are planning their Syria operations.
Great, thank you.
I'll start with As'ad's question, and I think As'ad has, asked the question and answered at the same time. Yes, As'ad, I do believe that. I mean, we all in the same kind of, cycle, and we know that there has been a lot of pressures by international community to push us or push the organizations who are working on the non-governmental areas to go and register in Damascus and work in Damascus. And we know that many of them have started to open offices in Damascus or liaising offices or prepare for this phase. And we also know that there has been an incredible increase of the civil society support to civil society in the regime area control. And here I would like to, even though it's a little bit far from the questions, but I would like to mention one thing is that one of the general observations regarding the increased number of civil society in the regime area control is basically one way of the regime to deal with the opposition, the civil society who are on the opposition side. I do believe that donors and many of the international community have certain solutions for us. And it's going to be very challenging for us actually to face this, because imagine with me if all the support, whether it's technical or funding or whatever that we get from those international donors, will be cut in the coming 2 years, where we are going to be, and that's basically also tackle the questions of the question of Zaina. To go to Rana's question, I do believe that women's rights in the PYD area is very genuine. When they talk about political participations and having women side by side with men, I do believe it's genuine. Many people might think that this is more of like a propaganda, but from knowing them and working in this area, I do think that it's a genuine. However, when it comes to social life and even to the political life, women in the Kurdish regions, even if they had more rights or like they seem to be more active on different levels, they're still part of the Syrian community who pressure women, who have like a lot of restrictions to what women can do and what they can't do. In the Kurdish region, many women would commit suicide or like go with the honor killing because they've been subjected to domestic violence or other type of violence, and there was no mechanisms like elsewhere to basically protect women. The PYD had created certain kind of mechanism to deal with gender-based violence, let's say, and Beit al-Mar'a is one of them. I think that the groups are working more on gender-based violence. One of it is because it exists and it's there, but the main thing is because it's welcomed. It's not welcome to work with survivors of rape in Idlib and other places. That's why people intend to work on this underground, or you would find very few organizations working on that. But in the PYD area, it's very welcome that you tackle these kind of issues.
Thank you. Hayed?
Hi, my name is Hayed, Chatham House. Just to quickly, can I comment and ask a question? Make one comment and one question.
Yeah.
Just on this issue in particular, I think we have to differentiate between basically empowering women on the on the social aspect of things, and then basically allowing them to be key decision makers. Because I don't know if this is what Rana was referring to or not, but according to what I noticed when I talked to different key actors within different councils affiliated with this SDF, is that even men don't have that kind of authority over making decisions. So I'm not sure that women have that kind of authority, because the division is not only between women and men, it's between cadros and non-cadros. Cadros are the ones who are basically hardcore Kurdish members who were part of the PKK or basically trained and affiliated with the PKK in Qandil and other places. And those are the ones who make the decisions. And this is why I think it's important.
And they happen to all be men.
Sorry?
No,
there are women. Like if you look at the PAD and the co-chairs of the PAD, not now, the ones before, the Ilham, what was her name? Ilham Ahmad and Saleh Muslim. And according to how people perceive them, Ilham is the one, because she's the cadre one. She's the one who makes the decision. So it's not, this is what I'm saying, is like the division is not men and women, it's cadre and non-cadre. I will end this discussion here. The question I have right now is that if you just go a few months, like if we go to the discussion that took place a few months ago when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was able to defeat Ahrar al-Sham, and then they captured most of the areas in Idlib. The discussion within the EU and with different policymakers was mainly focusing on what should we do in that area. And many of them said that we should continue our humanitarian aid, but we should stop any basically support going to other groups. Mainly, I'm talking about civil society groups who are working with with local councils and other issues. I quickly after that started looking at the role of civil society groups in directly resisting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And what I saw was that most of the efforts to counter Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they cannot fight. So the only thing that they can do, and is as effective or even more effective than fighting back, was to support those local governance structures and prevent Hayat Tahrir al-Sham from taking over those areas. So the advice I was giving to those policymakers was, if you do this, you are doing Hayat Tahrir al-Sham the best, basically, gift ever, because this is exactly who they are opposing to. Now, as we were talking about before, the situation is changing there. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is basically being kicked out of some areas to others. What would you be telling those decision makers right now about how to deal with different civil society groups, whether under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or other areas, especially in Idlib, because it's a big issue for them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ibrahim and then Tamara.
Ibrahim Alabi, Syrian Legal Development Program. A quick comment and a question. I think we need to be a bit critical or criticize ourselves a little bit as Syrian civil society as well. The organization that I run went to a few Geneva rounds, didn't go to others, but what I've also seen is that assuming that de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, just wants us there for a box-ticking exercise, you're still getting 5-10 days in Geneva where all the missions are there, where all the international NGOs are there. And what I've seen in meetings and actually heard is that NGOs have complained that de Mistura is getting them without an agenda, and that annoys them and, to a large extent, that they're just bringing us here, not knowing what to do, and then sending us back. So I also see that there is a role for civil society to be better prepared. I know they come 4 or 5 days before the Geneva talks, but we shouldn't wait for the Geneva talks to formulate our policies. They should be ready, and then when the channel opens, we should take them. I think we do have a big role to play as Syrian civil society. My question is about the donors. You've tackled the issue of extremism and being reluctant to fund in areas where HTS is controlled. But I also want to see whether you think donors have a responsibility when it comes to the programs that they fund and then get bombed. The majority of funding that is in Syria at the moment, say Ghouta, for example, they are funded by international organizations, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, Australians, but we don't hear any support for their partners once they get into some sort of trouble in that sense. We also see a responsibility for donors when it comes to investing in advocacy effort or telling their partners not to engage in political controversies because of breach of neutrality. So I'm really interested to see what you think the role of the donors should be, other than the issue of extremism, particularly on the point of neutrality and the point of stepping up when their partner gets, when the programs gets destroyed, physically destroyed.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I wish Maria was still with us. She told me about a partner who died on the job, and the donor wouldn't pay the rest of her salary for that month because she wasn't.
They said that the family was not vetted, so they are not sure that the money will go and finance those groups who will use $100 in order to kill the rest of Syria.
Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara Rifai. I'm a human rights and humanitarian advocate, and I have a question to you, the civil society experts, on what your main ask would be to donors, to the UN, who look for partners, and who, by virtue of their mandate, will have to partner with people in Damascus and in government areas. There is no way around it. They're going to have to do it. Now, our discussion about the affiliation of the new civil society organizations in government control areas is one thing. Everyone knows who is who, but that is not to say that every single NGO, even though that NGO is accepted in government areas, will necessarily carry out politicized activities.
Even military ones.
No, not necessarily, that's what I'm saying.
No, I'm saying
oh.
those who carry political, they also carry
Okay, so I want to know, because now what's happening is most of the donors' money will start trickling back to Damascus anyway. I mean, there has been a huge effort to extend Security Council resolution that allows for cross-border aid and support to civil society organizations working in opposition areas, but that's not going to last for very long. So what is the strategy and what is your main ask? These people, these governments, these donors, these international organizations have to go through they have to spend money in Damascus. What is it that we can still ask? We cannot ask them not to support X, Y, and Z. It's just not realistic. We cannot keep repeating, oh, but these are all registered under the umbrella of Al-Amani, therefore you should not. They will. What's the ask? Something realistic that we should tell the international community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So 3 important questions. Salim, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start by Ibrahim's point, with which I fully agree, and this is why I stated at the very beginning of my talk, is that regardless of how much remarks we have over the process and the way the process has been led so far, we have to stick to, or we have to claim our share in the process. You know, I think the problem is that Citizens for Syria and many other great organizations have been trying very, very hard to work on the agenda, but I think the dimension through which the agenda is moved into the mainstream conversation is still missing, you know. So people are going prepared sometimes, and people have an idea about what they want to achieve through these conversations, but these elements do not make it finally to the agenda where the hardcore discussion is actually happening. And I think this is one of the missing links. Then how to translate this into like actual elements of discussion, this is something I think we also, of course, need to be critical and we need to work on. Tamara, about your question, I think definitely this is one of the dilemmas with which we are faced today. But also I think it is, I will challenge and push a little bit and say that, you know, it's not only our responsibility alone, because this is also part of the broader political process, you see. So, and it is only one element of the broader political process. So I think also we've been given much more than we can handle in terms of our commitment and our responsibility. So, and I think there have been many voices of former UN high-profile officials who are also being critical to the mode of operations in Damascus. So the critique is not only, yeah, but I'm not being constructive. I will leave it to.
I'm the donor. What are you asking me?
Well, my ask is that those vetting processes that you put in place, they should be more considerate to the fact that we are filling a void neither you nor the government can fill. So at least in non-government areas.
No, my question is about the government areas, because there was a part of the discussion, sorry Leila, part of the discussion was, but all of these NGOs now operating from Damascus. That's now a reality?
Yeah.
And the donors and the UN who give their letters of accreditation to the government that is still in place, what are we telling them? We can't say that. So what is it that we can ask to go around it?
Okay.
Would you like to jump in?
I mean, can they go around it, Tamara? I mean, it's the fact. Yeah. UN, since the establishment, work with organizations who are registered and approved by the government. And UN in general, they only work based on a certain kind of approval by the government. So if we say, don't as you say, it's not going to happen. What can we change is that to create, two things. First of all, I think we've all read at least or like heard about the reports of the Syria campaign, who basically addressed how much violations the UN has committed inside Syria, and how the money that goes to the Red Crescents or others being actually used somewhere else. So maybe more vetting and more monitoring from the UN side to make sure that all this assistance that is going is basically going to the right hand, and it's not going to the military, it's not going to the Ba'athist and other government affiliated. And this is absolutely the responsibility of the UN to make sure that the money is going in the right place. That's number one. Number two is that there should be other mechanisms to support others who are not part of the government's area control. And that means that not only the UN, well, the UN is basically an implementing, an implementer, let's say, rather than a decision makers, because some others make the decisions on behalf of the UN, if we want to say it like this. But then it's the international community responsibility to create other supports for the organizations and civil society who are not willing to be registered in Damascus. And that takes me back to the question that is raised by Asad. It is actually our responsibility to advocate for not, if we don't want to go to Damascus and if we don't want to work under the regime control, then our wish need to be respected, and we need to find solutions to continue challenging the support for the organizations who are not going to register with the Assad. I want to go back to, because I think Rana asked a very important question, or at least it's one of the important questions for me. So, and I forgot to answer, so I'll tackle this issue about what are the challenges that is actually facing civil society in neighboring countries. And I want to say that 2017 has been extremely hard for us at Bada'il and for all civil society organizations registered in Turkey. Over the past couple of years, it seems that the government was, giving us a space to operate. There was not much of obstacle put in that we were faced during our operation in Turkey. This has completely changed in 2017. I don't know, maybe the Turkish government woke up in the morning and then found out that they have given a lot of space to the Syrian, and they wanted to control this again. So they start putting, a lot of restrictions, which was a big surprise for us, and we didn't know how to deal with it. One of it is basically the work permit. No one is giving work permit. They're not willing to give work permit. And not only this, organizations in Gaziantep for the past months, they've been working from home and in cafes because the Turkish government will go to the office and arrest everyone who doesn't have a residency, and some of them were deported back to Syria or outside of the country. Which basically, if we like it or not, Turkey is one of the biggest operations in the neighboring country, and the work that is carried out by the civil society in Turkey, whether it's a cross-border covering the north and the PYD area, etc., or the work that is carried out inside Turkey with refugees, given that there is more than 2 million and a half Syrian refugees in Turkey, by not stopping the Turkish government, or at least to start a kind of a pressure or dialogue with the Turkish government to facilitate a little bit the work of the Syrian civil society, issue a work permit, allow them a little bit of space and support to continue their operations, I mean, people will continue to run away. And unfortunately, they will come to Europe, so be careful. I mean, yes, I mean, many of the people, I know from our colleagues who basically were stable in Turkey, kind of, when this kind of work permit thing started to appear, they started to think of how they're going to cross the sea. I mean, it's a fact, or finding other alternatives to basically leave the country and start a life somewhere else. Back to Hayed, I mean, what can I say, Hayed? It's, I mean, you also asked the questions and answered it, because I think that supporting civil society and movements is crucial for any kind of resistance against extremist groups. And many of our partners in different discussions would say it in different phrases, but I would like to quote or to rephrase it basically. That maybe some of the work, some of the work that we are doing right now, seen by others as if not important or doesn't have an impact. But basically, what we are doing right now is, and the pressure that we're trying to put on different actors, is actually going to lead us to reserve our place and space in the future. And that's very important. I mean, even if some of the work seems to be like not really important nowadays, but for the future, it's important to continue supporting civil society because they are the one who is going to fight extremism. They are the one who is going to address a human rights violation. No matter if it's Assad or someone else in power, they will continue to challenge those actors. Yeah, that's my answer. Basically.
Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes. I'm not going to take any more questions, but I'm going to ask both of you to conclude on one note. If everyone in this room, you can ask them to go tell their teams or their networks or the people they know or have access to about one thing about the work you do and about the role of civil society in Syria, and you want them to spread the word. Can you tell me one thing each?
Maybe I have 3 key messages. I think I wouldn't want you to leave the room without having in mind, if I may. The first is the fact that the civil society in the formal process needs to be brought in more seriously. And the second point, the fallacy that there is nothing that can be done, because there is always something that can be done. And the fallacy that the Russians are the only key player. I think Syrians deserve to know if there are any parties that are willing really to step up their support, rather than hiding behind the fallacy that the Russians are the only player that can change the rules of the game. Because this is, I think, is low-level media work about what should be a broader policy, rather than constructing a policy around blaming the Russians. And I think the third thing is that, because it was quoted in the previous session, something about World War III erupting. April 2017 didn't lead to a World War III, you know. And if April 2017's strike of the United States were repeated a couple of times in 1 week, I think we wouldn't be sitting here today. We are not dealing with a regime, we are dealing with a mafia. And I think it's about time for many parties that want to hide behind their fingers to really show themselves.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Ola?
Well, I think, I mean, me personally, when I look and observe the work of civil society inside Syria and the activists, I mean, I'm always impressed by the work that they are doing. Let's not forget that we're not talking about a normal civil society who's based in a place where there is some kind of sustainability and water and internet, and there is no aircraft on their head. Let's always remember that civil society, with the work that they are doing, they're doing it under the most difficult circumstances. And they deserve to be supported, they deserve to be listened to, and I will emphasize on the listened to, because I think sometimes we all, I mean, even Syrians themselves and Syrian organizations need to learn more how to listen to Syrians and how to listen to ourselves, and how to make others actually listen to us as well. Syrian civil society are the future, so I would encourage all of us to think of the circumstances that they are working in, and provide with whatever support that can be done, because sometimes just saying one word on social media can make a difference.
Absolutely, I couldn't put it any better. I'm gonna conclude by thanking you both very, very much for your time today, but also for the work you do. You are as a Syrian, you're the only hope that I will have a country to go back to. So thank you for what you're doing. And to the civil society that you're working with and through, who don't have the option of turning the TV off and taking a break. So thank you very, very much. And thank you all for making the time to be here.